computer. It's going to probably show a little pop-up on your screens as well. You're going to click OK because you're going to be okay with it. It's going to be recorded for posterity for all of those who can't join us today. And we've got a guest, and that guest is Federico. And I met Federico by chance at the Oxford Real Farming Conference this year. Um, I just went back to the lunch area looking for friends, and I found Hannah Thorogood, who's a good friend from the permaculture scene. And Hannah was also looking for friends and food. And both Hannah and Federico were at the Pasture for Life stall. And so whilst I was chatting with Hannah, Hannah introduced me to Federico, and what interested me was Federico was there with his book, and um, he started saying things that just made sense to me. And so I thought, this is something that connects the mainstream of people basically because everybody eats. Connects the mainstream with agriculture in a very positive way. And I would lie if I would say that I've read the book. I haven't, and it's a thick book, by the way. So I'm going to go out on a limb and trust Federico's expertise here, so he can share it directly with you guys and tell you what's in the book. I'm going to actually encourage you to buy the book and read it, but and I'll do it myself. But the main thing is what I wanted to do is have you the ability to ask Federico questions, and I wanted to learn more about
Good boy.
all of those fads and diets that Federico has explored, which have overtaken our society over the last few decades probably. And every few years there's a new diet that tells you, this is how you eat to be healthy, and and do this to live to 100, and do that to be ethical, and all of these things. But in the end, there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of marketing. And here we are trying to grow food, and we're here trying to grow food in a way that doesn't hurt the environment and produces something that is healthy for people, right? And so, people, I thought that for people in this community, it just is something that would make a lot of sense to see if there's some connections. And as I said in the email, the thing that really sold me on what Federico has done, Federico looked at organic food and whether it's affordable. And so I'll let him tell you this story, but he ran an experiment, and he's shortcut the story. I'll tell you the result. It's affordable, but there's a catch, and he'll tell you later what that catch is. So, without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make Federico into a spotlight. So there you go.
Ooh.
Now, now you are the most important person in this call, and I'll let you crack on. Introduce yourself, and we'll have a light conversation like that.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Hi everyone, and really grateful for you all to sign up for this call. And yeah, thank you, Daniel, for asking me. Um, I'm going to start with a little story, which basically was the initial trigger that got me writing this book. The book is in many ways the result of a lifetime of thinking around these issues, but there was a sort of human trigger. It was mentioned in the book with his permission, and the human trigger was my dear former colleague, a guy called Alex, who's a very good friend of mine, who to me represented what I would call the sort of average middle-aged person in the UK who might be overweight, has a few health issues, and is completely and utterly confused about what to eat, how to eat, and what advice to follow. So Alex will be coming into the office, on a Monday and say, Freddie, he used to call me Freddie, Freddie, I'm gonna go on the keto now. So if we go on the keto diet for a while, then invariably, his best laid plans will not yield the results he wanted. And then he will go through a sort of gluten-free phase, and then he will pay extortionate amounts of money to go to nutritionists and dietitians to have these various supposed intolerances tested. And so you can see where I'm going with this. It was a sort of a roller coaster of fads, advice that he was being given, both from what I would call institutional authorities. So whether it's the NHS or the World Health Organization, who declared that red meat is effectively cancerous, famously a few years back. But also, the various fad diets that come and go over time. And I've taken the trouble to collect some of the headlines from different eras as well. And, you can find, say, Time magazine saying that saturated fats were a huge problem back in the 80s, on the cover. So they had a picture of possibly bacon, I can't remember right now, but basically saturated fats were the great evil. Then not so long ago, a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, they had a cover that said that butter was back, apparently. So we've gone through sort of phases of, an obsession with certain specific nutrients, and an advice comes and goes. And the result is that the average person like Alex doesn't know where to go, has no solution, and has a very anxious relationship with food, because it's either induces guilt or worry or uncertainty. And then the results, of course, the practical results is that, like many people, he is overweight, I'm sure pre-diabetic, has gout and other conditions, which are becoming increasingly common, as we all know. So anyway, I wanted to answer his question in many ways in the form of a book. He asked me what my opinion was, and 4 years later, here is a very long opinion. And he is reading the book, for the record.
It was supposed to be an email, Federico.
It was an email originally, and basically it was a sort of 10-page Word document, which eventually made its way around the office. And a lot of people came up to me and said, Fred, this is the making of a book. And then, we had the lockdowns, and I was put on furlough, and that was the opportunity to write the book. But anyway, so I wanted to answer his question, basically, which was, how can the average person navigate diet and nutritional advice that seems to change all the time and seems to yield such poor results? How can one navigate it and make sense of it? Secondly, how can one make food choices that satisfy, all the various concerns one might have around food? And there are what seem to be competing concerns sometimes, so it could be, health, body weight, the environment, animal welfare, managing a tight budget, feeding one's family well. There are lots of concerns that one has around food. And then, of course, pleasure. One wants to get pleasure from food as well. So all of these, is it possible to satisfy all these concerns and make consistent food choices that address all of these? As I say, I think in the back of the book, as I recall, can one have one's cake and eat it, so to speak? Is it possible? And I try to answer these questions from somewhat unconventional background. So I say up front in the book, I'm not a medical authority or a scientific authority. And somewhat facetiously, I will suggest that might be a good thing, given that so much of the terrible advice does come from people wearing white coats, and they continuously disagree with each other anyway. So who are we to listen to? So my background on the theoretical side is agricultural research and philosophy, which are not obvious subjects to come together, but they kind of do. And then on a practical side, I've got many years as an organic grower. So I grow a lot of my own food. I shoot and I fish, and I procure a lot of my own food, but mostly I grow a lot of food. So I got a lot of experience with the soil, with plants, with animals, and then a traditional home cook. I grew up in a almost like a different era. So, I recall this in the book. I first walked into the first McDonald's in Italy, which opened in 1986. And I walked in because one of the kids in my school wanted to go there for his birthday. So I was invited and I went, and that was my first and last experience with McDonald's because, I've been brought up with a very, very traditional household. And, my flavors and my taste and my habits were very, very different from most people. And they remain so. And so I have this background, and in the book, I basically go back I look back in time to how we got to where we are. And I mostly look at two fields, agricultural science and nutritional science, which in many ways came up around a similar time. So, the nutritional science really is the result of the so-called chemical revolution. So 19th century, when basically molecules started to be identified, and the first concept of things like the words we hear all the time now, protein or carbohydrate and fat and so on, and the various minerals and vitamins were first identified. Now, at the same time, right, literally overlapping, the same process was happening in agriculture, where the first attempts were made to identify the minerals and the nutrients that were most important in fertility. Where the whole NPK outlook sort of first came. And it's really a 19th century, early 20th century phenomenon. So it's relatively recent by historical terms. And these two movements came up at the same time. Of course, in some respects, as all reductive science is, they can be very useful. So, for example, it was very useful to identify vitamin C so that we knew why people could get scurvy, okay, or why certain minerals and vitamins cause certain diseases when they were not there. So why pellagra afflicted people who ate maize, which hadn't been nixtamalized and therefore had no niacin in it. All that kind of knowledge, like all knowledge, is useful. The problem is that basically once we went down that reductive route, our worldview changed as well. So we came to see soil as a medium as opposed to a living thing, something through which nutrients and minerals are filtered through to a plant. And then animals, became effectively protein. And I quote this in the book, but you can often hear people working in the livestock sector referring to themselves or their animals as people in the protein business or animals as protein, which is not just very reductive, but also very wrong and ethically problematic, I would argue as well. Once you reduce plants, animals, and indeed people to their simplest molecular formulations, a lot can go wrong as a consequence. So basically, look, I took that history, and then my main argument basically is that if we reverse this kind of reductive thinking, but only use the reductive knowledge as an additional tool to how to make sense of the world, then a lot of the confusions that we now have suddenly dissipate, and a lot of things make a lot more sense. So once we stop looking at, say, a chicken as a bundle of proteins, and once we stop looking, at a potato as just a bundle of carbohydrates, then a lot of the questions we might have resolve themselves. And then we also have to, in many ways, go back to some of the thinking of the founders of the organic movement and the alternative movement, who made that connection really explicitly. So, Albert Howard often talked about how, the health of the soil, ultimately led to the health of mankind, and there was a sort of link between soil, plant, animal, mankind, and civilization, that there was this link. And if you broke that link somewhere, then there would be serious consequences. So it's a much more holistic view. And in the book, there's a couple of experiments, and I will come to the one that Daniel mentioned because it's really important. But there's a couple of very simple experiments, and that kind of mind, in many ways, mind experiments, but also practical experiments. So I encourage the readers to think of two of the probably the most common foods in the UK. So one is chicken, which was a luxury, of course, until not that long ago. The most expensive of all meats, and it's now become the cheapest of all meats. And encourage people to think about basically, what it takes for a £4 chicken from Tesco to end up on the shelf. And there's no secret. I mean, I don't need to give you the details. Red Tractor approved chicken is a 6-week process in a barn of a bird living in its own feces, weak-boned, fundamentally unhealthy, miserable creature, which ends up as a £4 product. And then because I've spent a lot of time on farms doing research, I went back to a farm in Gloucestershire, which I knew very well. And being a very good farm, which had nothing to hide, the owner basically said to me, Fred, look, if you remember, the chicken house is that way, the pigs are that way, the cattle are over there. Basically, I'm busy, bugger off, and and go take a look, take all the pictures, videos you want. It's fine. So off I went, and I went to look at their chickens, and they were living in very nice chicken coops. They could go in and out as they wanted. Their pens were basically rotated around a huge field of grassland. The farmer had sown seeds of chicory and other plants to grow in these plots. And then eventually, once the chickens are basically, eaten and scratched the whole area, then we moved on. Nothing revolutionary, but that's the point. It was just very sound, wholesome techniques. And I can guarantee you these were healthy, happy chickens. You could see them, I could smell them, I could get close to them. They lived a lot longer than the ones on the Tesco shelf. They were slaughtered in one of the barns next to the field. So they traveled probably 100 or 200 yards. It was a completely different story. Obviously, there's a big difference in price. But what I wanted the reader to think about was this. I said, well, look, if you ask the average nutritionist, or if you ask your GP, they will tell you that fundamentally, when it really boils down to it, there's no difference between these two animals. They're both 20% protein, 2 or 3% fat. They will concede that there might be some micronutrient differences. Okay, they might say, well, yeah, maybe the chicken that's eaten a bit of grass and insects, might have a few more micronutrients. They might have less or no pesticide residues or glyphosate residues in the system, but ultimately these are small differences. These are recommended foods. They're protein rich. And what I invite the reader to do is to say, well, look, do you really need someone in a white coat to tell you that actually there's a radical difference between these two animals? One is a inherently unhealthy creature, miserable creature, and the other is basically a chicken living as a chicken should. So there is to use another word that used to be used in the organic movement, which probably gave it accusations of, muck and magic. There is a vitality to the second chicken, a vitality to it, an inherent health and life to it, which is completely lacking from the other ones. So as I apply this mode of thinking to all the various foods and products of agriculture, and you really go a very long way to then demystifying a lot of the obsessions of the modern age, and a lot of the obsession with one nutrient or the other, whether it's saturated fats, whether it's sugar, whether it's carbohydrate, whatever it is, whether it's veganism, whether it's, plants versus animals, all of these things become a lot easier to solve once you play this experiment. And you can also do a practical experiment, as I encourage the readers. You can try different, the same product, same recipe, but from a different source, and you will see differences. Anyhow, in the book, I go through the whole history, the sort of experiments, and then I look through all the various fads and ideas that are ongoing at the moment, so past and present. Um, and then finally, I want to give the reader a sort of guide. So the third part of the book is what I call an A to Z of food. So it's literally a shopping guide, a selection guide, how to read labels, how to make sense of products, what constitutes desirable products and undesirable products. So it's an A to Z of all foods, what not to eat and what to eat, and how to buy it and how to select it and what things mean, what is a legal definition, what is just marketing, and so on and so forth. After the A to Z, I decided to sort of take another challenge, which was I'm perfectly aware that one of the main objections I will get, and I have gotten for years in my life, is people say, well, Fred, look, it's all very well and good, for you to pontificate about, expensive chickens and, grow your own food or go to farmers markets and, spend money on food. But, for the average Joe on the street, this is not plausible. The average person has to go to Lidl or Asda and eat processed food. There's no other way. So I thought, look, I'm gonna take this head on and sort of preempt it. So I conducted an experiment, which is what Daniel was alluding to. So the final chapter of my book is called The Average Joe Experiment. So the average Joe blogs. So I looked up at the statistics, and basically in the UK, the average person, the average male adult, spends £51 a week on food. So that's £7 a day on all food, plus tea and coffee. So no alcohol, but all food. The average female spends very close to that, so maybe 48 as opposed to 51. So anyway, you get the gist. It's about £7 a day. So I conducted an experiment for 28 days, so 4 weeks, where I thought, is it possible for me to basically live up to all the arguments I've made so far in this book and follow my own A to Z guide consistently on this budget? Because it is a fair criticism. I mean, if it was absolutely impossible to follow, this different way of seeing food for the average person, then that would be a real limitation, maybe a serious problem. Anyway, I conducted an experiment, and the results were good in the sense it is possible, and I will come to some of the caveats. And in the end result was I did manage to spend I think it was 90 pence over each week. So, stuck to the budget pretty much. And I think 57% on top of my head of the food I bought was organically certified. The rest wasn't, but the rest was what in the book I define as, in the book I have a concept which I call organic or equivalent. And by equivalent, I mean that, as I'm sure you guys know as farmers, there are plenty of products and producers who grow and raise food that is not certified organic, and it may not be certified organic for a number of reasons, mostly financial. A lot of the small producers don't want to spend the fee every year, or because they have a consistent client base that they don't need to have that extra label to make it worthwhile. So there will be plenty of producers who produce food using organic methods, which may not be organic. And then equally, there are also some organic products on the market which are not particularly good, that just meet the bare minimum or are of slightly obscure origin. So there are some nuances. So I use the word organic in a broader sense. So organic philosophy and methodology, which, there are some of the best farmers around do not have organic certification, but they use organic methods. So for the remaining 43%, basically, it was food I bought from the farmers market here in London. And I interviewed the farmer who supplied some beef and lamb and pork for me. So I gave him a full interview. And basically, this was a 100% pasture-based system of raising heritage cattle and sheep out in Somerset. So basically, it was pasture pasture fed for about 9, 10 months a year, and then for 2 months when it was too cold in the winter, they would be fed with the hay that was harvested from the very same farm. So they had no crops, no arable crops, no feed for these animals, just grass. They had a woodland where they kept, where they keep rather, they keep pigs, and they have an interesting pig. It's basically a hybrid between. It's something that used to be done in Italy as well, where basically a domestic pig has some interbreeding with wild boar to give it some wildness. And so he kept them in a woodland. The limitation here was that he got a lot of waste vegetable from a neighboring farm, and then he bought in some feed, from the local supplier, which was probably not the best. But so there were some caveats, and he would not have got organic certification for what he did, but much of what he produced was great, and what he did was really good. And there's an interview in the book about his methods, no fertilizers, no chemical fertilizers, rather, and so on. And then I got some fruits and vegetables from, again, a small producer who didn't use sprays. Admittedly, occasionally use some NPK fertilizer, but no herbicides, no pesticides. So that was the other half of the shopping. But the experiment worked, and I had a food diary of what I ate and so on, which was good fun as well. The caveats are it only really works if whoever undertakes this task is willing to spend a little time in the kitchen. So with zero cooking, I don't think it is possible in a nutshell, especially on an average or below average budget. So if you want quality ingredients, which are the foundation of all great cuisine, one needs to transform those raw ingredients. And before I realize I've rambled on a bit, so I'll give one last example, which was I went to Tesco to do some research because I went to all the supermarkets to see what they sell. And they were selling ready-made minestrone soup. Minestrone soup is a classic Italian soup, as I'm sure you know. And they had these tubs of it. And I took note of the price and weight of it. Anyway, during the experiment, I made my own minestrone so I had some organic legumes I bought online, then fresh vegetables from the farmer's market, organic olive oil, parmesan, beautiful, if I may say so. Anyway, when I calculated the cost and weight of each bowl of this minestrone, it was exactly the same as the Tesco minestrone. And the reason was, of course, that I put my labor and time into it. So I guess that's the main caveat. The other caveat is to get access to good ingredients is easier in certain parts of the country than others. There are literal food deserts in some parts of the country. So there needs to be more planning, a bit of traveling, some bulk buying, some ordering online to make it viable. Anyway, I'll stop there. All I'll say is that the book was designed originally for Alex, my overweight dear friend, but ultimately it's designed for anyone. Because I said the concerns people might have are different. It might be health or body weight or the environment, animal welfare. And I like to think one can have one cake and eat it and sort of address all of these things by abandoning a lot of the ideological presumptions that now dominate the world of food and farming. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
What's the probability that Alex is going to start cooking?
Actually, this is the funny thing. Alex actually does do the cooking. And so does his wife. He doesn't always buy the best ingredients. And B, it's intertwined with a lot of crap in between. So he might make a good roast dinner with, good beef. But then if he's having, 2 packets of crisps before lunch and then Oreos after lunch or whatever it is he's having, then things go south very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of sweet tooth then somewhere.
Yeah, which is not always a problem. Like in the book, I talk about what I call sugar phobia. But again, we've gone from one extreme to the other. Sugar was promoted as a health food in the I found an advert the other day actually from the sort of in the sort of 50s and 60s. There was no issue around sugar. Now it's become the absolute demon. And again, it's based on not differentiating between its sources. There's a huge difference between high fructose corn syrup or white sugar from uh, from sugar beets and say rapadura, which maybe you don't know what it is, but basically it's the most unrefined form of sugar. Um, there are differences, and then the context is everything. How are you consuming it? In what context? There's a big difference between buying the best quality sugar and making your own biscuits, which I did in the experiment, by the way, um, and buying Kit Kats. Again, if you go down the reductionist nutritionist mindset and think all sugar is evil, then you go down the wrong route. There is actually nothing wrong with some sweet food or some sugar. I don't think.
Judith, unmute yourself.
Hi there. I didn't manage to catch all of it, but I've certainly got the
So,
gist of it, and I think it's great. When you calculated the cost of your minestrone soup or any other meals, did you include the cost of using the cooker?
that's a really good question. I didn't. So I'm afraid I have to be neutral on that. It's
Yeah,
a, yeah. So the really good point. I mean, transport as well. So transport and uh, cookery is another cost.
Hmm.
Uh,
I
and of
think
course,
with
a
people that are
microwave is
really,
cheaper.
yeah, with families that are really financially stressed, even just using the cooker is a problem.
Yeah, it's a good point. And
Yeah,
I mean, the one thing I do say in the book is that at least one thing one can do is bulk cook as well as bulk buy.
yeah, yeah.
Like
But
obviously, if
but
you make a
then
stew,
then you need a fridge or a freezer.
yeah,
And
yeah,
actually, I mean, a lot of us are okay with that, but actually, there's a lot of families out there that are really struggling with
yeah.
cookers, fridges, and freezers are just completely out the game. But yeah, I mean, it's what, I'm not deriding what you're doing, but I just think it is a point that families that are really seriously financially stressed.
That's why
Uh,
you've got because you've got like what Federico used was an average
yeah,
Yeah, it
budget.
was an average,
But it's
not
gonna be
yeah.
below the average. It's gonna be
yeah,
above the average always.
I mean
absolutely,
the
absolutely.
yeah. So I looked at the average because as I said, the accusation of being elitist implies that the average person cannot do this. I've actually had people tell me the average person can't do this. So I'm arguing at least the average person can, and the
Yeah,
average person doesn't spend much on food. Now, for the below average, in the chapter, I do consider it, and I do suggest ways of cutting back on the budget even more, but it's inevitably harder. Just like
yeah,
anything is harder if you're on a below average budget. For example, there'll be a lot less meat, a lot more, bulk of pulses and potatoes and rice and things like that. Don't get me wrong, my argument is still that whatever your budget, there's still better and worse options. So if you've only got £5 a day or £4 a day on food, there are still better and worse options.
mm,
That's all. Neither of them might be great options. That's unfortunately, that's just the reality. But there are still better options. The really horrible ultra processed microwave meal, there are probably still better options,
yeah, yeah,
nonetheless. In fact, not
uh,
probably, definitely, there are better options.
yeah,
I think I was going to say that in our area we're talking about buying together, so that and we've got a farmers market, but we've found that the younger families can't get there. People with small children don't get to the farmers market, so they don't get their local produce. So we're looking at a way that we can make that available to them a time that they could pick up after school and things like that. So there's access to it, because what we're finding in our area is access to that food is difficult.
Mm.
And I want to set up some sort of co-op where we're buying in bulk as well. So we're doing the organic tins of beans or, tomatoes and stuff like that, pasta, that we can buy together and then we can distribute it. And so then that brings the price down for people. They're not having to run around and going to cheap supermarkets, or because it's the older people are fine, But it's the families of the young children that find it really difficult, and they're really pressed for time as well. So we need to find ways
Yeah.
that they can just swing by, because we're rural, so it's like places that they could, where they're going to be, and they can just pick things up and order it online. So that's what
That's
we're looking
great.
and then we're trying to get local food into schools, which is really difficult. So we're looking at maybe if we can do a day a week where we do local produce in the schools as well, and also teaching kids how to grow, because they don't know necessarily how to grow things and where the food comes from. So we're kind of looking at all those things. It's overwhelming, really, but
Yeah, but it's great. You got to start somewhere.
yeah, but it's the young families and kids. That's kind of where, yeah, the farmers market's been really successful, but it's not getting to the people we want it to get to. Yeah,
Even buying direct from farms can be quite cost effective. I mean, I've
yeah,
come
yeah,
across people
yeah,
who order whole animals literally with other
yeah,
people.
yeah,
So they
yeah,
order, a lamb with 3 or 4 other people, and they share the cost and one delivery. And so
yeah,
there are ways of
yeah.
getting economies of scale.
Yeah, but it's making that as accessible and as easy to busy people as possible, really. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Before I get to Matthew Adams, Ian Gould wanted to ask a question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Really interesting, and I look forward to getting hold of a copy of your book. I think it would sit really well alongside one I've already read, which is called "What Your Food Ate,"
Yeah,
which is an absolutely brilliant book about why food has or has not got nutrient density and this sort of thing. And I really thank you for making the point earlier that the fact it's got the organic label on it actually isn't enough. And this has been shown by the work that Dan Kittredge's organisation has done in the States with the Bionutrient Association, because they're showing that the only thing, and I stress the only thing, that is without doubt like a cause and effect thing on nutrient density in food is the amount of biology in the soil. And no lesser a person than Gabe Brown told me that some of the best and worst soil health he's ever seen has been on organic farms. Because what some people are doing is they're meeting the organic criteria of not applying pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, fertilizer, and they're basically farming some soil to death effectively until they can't make a return out of it, and then they just abandon it and move on somewhere else. So it doesn't necessarily mean, and it's a real shame, because there are some absolutely fantastic organic growers who do everything in the right way, as you suggested earlier. But in the way of looking where the person speaking before me was saying about getting stuff collaboratively and all that sort of thing, a lot of the benefit will only come if you do your real research on the credentials of, forget the label, check the credentials, check what it really means, because that's where the real benefits are going to come from inside the food.
Oh, definitely. I think one of the advantages of, as much as I sometimes resent how we're all continuously online and on screens and on the internet, one of the advantages of it is that sometimes you can look up a product or a farm quite quickly, do a bit of research and make sense of things, and get information.
Yeah, there's many of you have listened to John Kemp from America, and he was looking at basically some sort of way of testing food at the end of its production cycle. So regardless of the system that was used to produce it, check it before it gets into the market to say, right, these things are in it or not in it, as the case may be, depending on whether you talk about nutrients or toxins. But for fresh produce, I'm very concerned that that's going to be such a slow process that, one of the joys of eating fresh produce is that it's fresh and it hasn't had to wait for some sort of test. So, maybe the producer could be certified that their system is, generally producing stuff with really high credentials, rather than this batch of cucumbers has, or whatever. I think it has to be more a longer lasting certification than that. But the problem with all of these certification systems, it doesn't matter where it is, it tends to be practice based. And then what happens is people bastardize the practice and make it cheaper and do it worse and do it to a minimum standard, and then you don't get the outcomes that you're really looking for. And unfortunately, probably the only way you'll ever really get this right is growing your own food. But not all of us have got the space and things to be able to do things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Fred.
Hi.
We did meet at Oxford.
We did, didn't we?
Yeah.
Sorry, it was such a whirlwind. I
Yeah,
spoke to like I don't know, hundreds of people.
I know. And I didn't get time to quiz you about your book, so it's lovely to hear it come out here. And so just to say, so I'm the co-founder, director of Growing Real Food for Nutrition. So we're exploring how to measure food quality. I've just done it. Well, I've done a lot of work around that, and I've just recently come to the end of a 2-year project. Ian just then was talking about Dan Kittredge. Well, we used the method of the Bionutrient Food Association and brought that to the UK, and we ran some trials back in, was it 2022 or 2023? And I see James Argyle is on this call, so he was one of our participants. Hi, James. We looked at wheat, carrot, beetroot, and kale, and looked at samples of that. And that was a whole lovely big piece of work, which made me understand that nutrient density is not a good indicator of quality, but rather nutrient variation is. And it's a confusing thing for me to now say. Well-grown food, I'm sure, does have a lot more beneficial nutrients in, but like Dan Kittredge, we're trying to define food quality. And what I saw was a vast difference between the nutrient composition of food grown in the UK compared to the US. And that sets a problem for trying to define food quality by the mineral content, by the content of nutrients itself, because plants need to express diversity. So the same seed grown in different soils, climates, different growers will all express something different, and that will affect the amount of nutrients in it. So if you were trying to ever define food quality by nutrient density, you'd get stuck very quickly. And also, touching on the reductionist thing, there's a huge movement afoot around biofortification. And so, for example, the wheat seed that I saw with the most nutrients in it, because I was able to compare to the US database, was a seed owned by Syngenta. And so I'm not saying it was genetically modified. I'm not saying anything other than it was owned by Syngenta. We all know that company for fast track breeding and genetic engineering. And their wheat had more nutrients in it than anything else that we'd looked at out of 269 samples. I'm just flagging that up as an issue with the nutrient density thing. So we're looking at nutrient variation and trying to understand the quality of food. And where I'm developing our work towards now is beginning with taste testing to identify the quality of the food, and then we can send it for laboratory analysis to have a look at it. So we're trying to build a food quality standard database that would overcome one of your problems that you had in your experiment to just eat organic food. So it's that problem of certified and non-certified doesn't guarantee quality. So developing a food quality standard would guarantee the quality. And you can almost drop the label and just say, well, is this nutritious or not? And combined with it being nutritious, does that support healthy soil, water and air, and biodiversity? And I believe the two things are linked.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
yeah,
I mean, this is why I think it's more the organic outlook and methodology that's important rather than whether it's labeled or not.
yeah,
Because there'll be plenty of
yeah,
overlaps between different practitioners.
yeah,
I mean, especially in the US, some of the people in the regenerative movement, the pasture-based movement, they're absolutely not certified. So, people like, Will Harris, White Oak Pastures, and Joel Salatin and all these people, they have pasture-based systems based on living soils, but they have no interest in certification. But their products, they're inspired by people like Albert Howard and so on. So the certification is really, don't get me wrong, it can be useful and a good thing, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
So, I mean, I need to stop this and ask you my other question, if that's okay. But the point of building a food quality database is if we understand what quality is, then those that are growing the highest quality appear at the top of the database, and those underneath that will be encouraged to learn how to increase that quality. So it's a way of pulling quality through the supply chain by standing at the end of the supply chain, saying whether it's of quality or not. So that's the concept that Griffin's working to. But I was interested to know, in your book, did you delve into any of the things like the Nutritional Policy Board of the UK? Did you have a
No,
look
I didn't. I stuck
on that
to
board?
my main criticism in the UK was towards the NHS guidelines. So the NHS has got published nutritional guidelines. And I go back to my chicken experiment. The NHS's position on chicken is that the best thing is a healthy food, irrespective of where it comes from, but that you should take the skin off. So that's literally, you can look it up. That the NHS's position on chicken is that whether it's £4 from a factory farm or £20 from the beautiful pasture, no difference whatsoever. But you should take the skin off, which I have to say, it's a remarkably stupid idea. So I looked at the NHS's position because that they are the medical authority of this country, and I thought that's a pretty good way to start in terms of seeing what the average doctor might be trained to say or think. And I remember growing up, I had a friend I went to school with who trained as a doctor in the NHS, and we had this debate many years ago because he said, "Well, look, in a chicken you should eat the breast and not the leg." He said, because, white meat is better than what he called brown meat. Again, a really poor idea. But this is the training they get.
Sounds racist.
Yes. And, but it's a remarkably bad idea. But no, I didn't look at the board. But I suspect they feed into some of the NHS guidelines, I imagine. But I don't know.
With I'm not sure where I saw the information, but the members of the Nutritional Advisory Policy Board to the UK contain members from Tate and Lyle, Coca-Cola, all the usual suspects, and they are creating the policies that then get filtered down into nutritional policy. So I think it's a good place to have a look to see where some of this misinformation might be coming from, as there's a lot of vested interests that sit on that nutritional policy board.
Well, now that President Trump is in power and we are out of Europe, I'm just sitting here waiting for Brondo to be used as the as everything in our nutrition. Anyways, Charles has got his hand up. Let's go to Charles. You need to unmute yourself, sir. Unmute. There you
go. Hi, everyone. So I'm an arable farmer, but probably more interestingly for me, is I'm also a Zoe participant. So I'd be interested to know if you've got any links with them or anything like that. But what I've learned as a layman being part of that program, which is where you get tested yourself for things like blood sugar response to food, blood fat, blood lipid response, and also you get your stools tested. So I've had two of those now. So I've got a certain amount of experience with how different foods affect me, and I use their app and I pay for it, and you can go to the supermarket and scan barcodes and everything. But one of the takeaways I've got from that is that everyone is unique. So when we're talking about building food standards, defining foods, we're a long way from being able to say what is going to be appropriate for any of us, unless we individually test each other, test ourselves and know about that. And then in my role as a farmer, it seems to me that this is all linked together. I've made the connection between food and between farming and to the soil. And I think most people have absolutely no idea how new food is treated by the body. They have no idea about the microbiology in their body or the role of biodiversity has in our health. They don't know about these things. The process that I've been part of, because I started farming as a boy in the mid-70s, is that what we have really turned food into is a commodity. It's even called a commodity. So when it leaves the farm gate, it's called commodities. Producing human nutrition is actually a financial mechanism which is influenced, as just related to, by large corporations. And so I don't think there is a cat in hell's chance of ordinary people really knowing about food and what they should and shouldn't be eating, unless, of course, they read books like yours or they're part of Zoe. And I don't think a lot of them will ever get there. I really do. And when I look at what my grandchildren are eating and their generation, they are completely disconnected from healthy food. And that is what we should be having, is a great range of biodiversity in our food. It doesn't matter what label you call it. It doesn't matter so much whether you can define the nutrition in it. It's diversity, biodiversity, and that's what it really all boils down to, and that starts with the soil. So I just thought I'd say a bit of a statement, but I really do think that through the work with Tim Spector and Zoe, they've really opened my eyes. And I haven't read your book, but I should imagine it comes to a similar conclusion. Tim Spector did The Diet Myth, which was a very popular book, and that basically debunked all the diets. And until governments get hold of large corporations and start to make them stop using their money to influence policy for their own good and start actually taking the subject of human health seriously, I don't see how we're going to move forward with this.
Well, I feel sorry for your grandchildren. They go to Grandpa Charles and don't get any sweets. Come on.
Well, I do actually. I mean, the thing about the Zoe thing, I'm not trying to promote them. I have no interest in doing that. But they don't ever say, and I think you're the same, Fred. They don't say you don't have this. That's the whole point about a healthy diet. You don't deny yourself. You just say stuff which is heavily processed once in a while. It's a treat, not so often. Stuff which is more healthy for you, you try and focus on having more of. It's basic common sense. A lot of colour, a lot of vegetables, a lot of fruit. And the other thing I think we ought to do as well, we ought to be careful of, and I think I would heartily agree with the idea that we should check provenance. Don't just look at a label which says organic, because there's a lot of organic now being grown, top fruit and stuff being grown hydroponically. Now, I don't know, but it strikes me as we've lost the connection with the soil. I'm not sure you can say there's going to be any kind of meaningful biodiversity in those foods if they're grown hydroponically. It's just another plastic item, a grown plastic item.
Federico, anything to add?
Yeah, I can quickly respond. There's a lot there, but
Sorry.
I do share some of your sort of pessimism. In a sense, it's a very difficult task because, as you said, even if you look at younger people, the average young person, has been brought up in an even more confusing era than you or I have. And as you say, unless they come across, valuable knowledge and information, then it's going to be a very, very difficult task. So I do share your pessimism in many ways, but equally, I wanted to make my own contribution, in the sense, I hope that someone like Alex or someone who has children, would have access to this information and make better decisions. It'd be great to have some top-down solutions if they were available, but at the moment there aren't any obvious ones, and in fact things might even get worse in some respects. that doesn't mean we can't do anything, individually. So you as a farmer or anybody here can do something, whether it's sharing knowledge or growing and spreading good food or cooking for your neighbor or whatever it is. There are good positive choices we can make. We sound simplistic, but I do share your pessimism overall. I mean, even in my own lifetime, I've seen no negative changes. As I said, I remember the first McDonald's that opened in Rome, 1986. Okay, there is now 500 in the country, which for a country like Italy to have is a scandal, in my view, a national capitulation. Okay, I'll very briefly touch on Zoe because it's a long subject. I've read all of Tim Spector's books rather, and look, I might surprise you in the sense I have positive and negative feelings about the whole Zoe thing. So on the positive, I think is very broad recommendations, and he often has a list of them, like usually five, are broadly absolutely correct and consistent with what I would recommend. So, no ultra-processed foods, a diversity of plants in your diets, as you say, the multicolor approach, try to eat organic food. There are lots of positive things which I would agree with. What I do have an issue with is that, and I think it's probably scientific mindset and training that comes into it, is that is very much fixated on the microbiome as a new holy grail. And again, we've gone down this rabbit hole before in nutrition. So now it's apparently all about the microbiome, which affects everything, your health, your mind, and it's become an obsession. It's a new obsession now. And there are lots of now offshoots of the whole microbiome thing coming into play. And I put it to you that in the same way that, you probably don't need to ever know everything about soil, which you never will, by the way, none of us will.
No.
I don't really need to know the details of which creepy crawlies live in my gut to take actions which happen to be good for my gut. In other words, I can feed my organic plot and feed my microbiome quite well, I'm confident, without really knowing much about the biochemistry of specific microbes and fungi or whatever is in there. And then the other problem I have is based on these poo samples and sugar and fat tests, people are being told, and I'm sure you have, but all I need to do is quote Tim Spector himself, because he does the whole Zoe thing of himself, in the book. A lot of what I would consider perfectly good whole foods might end up being personally restricted. So, for example, in his book, Tim Spector tells us that grapes and I think it was oats don't agree with him as well as barley and some other fruit. Okay, so for him, and I will put it to you that, do we really need to have personalized lists of perfectly okay whole foods, which we're supposed to avoid, and others which we're supposed to go after? I have serious doubts about this, and I think it might lead to more food anxiety. And then there's also a cultural issue I have, which is he talks very openly about his vision for the future, and he says he would like a future where we almost have an AI mandated diet, where you have an app where you take a picture of every bloody thing you eat, and you go to the supermarket, and then the app will tell you, oh, this is a score of 80 for you and 70 for him. And quite frankly, it's even from a cultural point of view, I think it's a disaster. I really do. I mean, I think we all spend far too much time on our phones anyway. And the idea that we need to have this sort of AI powered future of personalized diet, I think is a problem. And I'll finish on this. Whilst I'm sure that you and I are unique in some ways, it's also true that we're not, in the sense we know what happens when any culture on the planet adopts the ultra-processed diet. So when the diet cokes and the ultra-processed foods and the fast foods and everything and the factory farmed meats come into a culture, people all develop the same problems. So obesity, gut problems, diabetes, heart problems, universally. So any population, anywhere on the planet, you give them that diet, that's what happens. On the other hand, we do know that whole foods diet based from a diversity of plants and animals, from healthy soils work anywhere on the planet. You can look at you can take an extreme to look at the blue zone studies, completely different parts of the planet. Sardinia, my ancestral homeland, Greece, Okinawa, Costa Rica. These people were eating different things. They had different ethnicities. They were different people, but the fundamentals of the universal diet are the same. Whole foods from healthy plants and animals, from healthy soils. And that's the foundation. And then, so that's really my take on it. So in the book, I talk a lot about the Zoe diet and the microbiome, because I look at all the things. So whilst I agree with the broader recommendations, the methodology and the culture, I don't. So that's my take on it.
Right. Carolyn, let's go to you. Sorry, Matthew, I'll make you wait a bit more.
Thank you. I just want to quickly introduce myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm in Scotland, in Fife. I am the coordinator for the Food Partnership and Food Strategy in Fife. And so I am on the Rise Up list for sustainable food places. And I got an email, came in, saw it at 4:20, clicked on the link, and here I am in this very interesting conversation. So that's my background. Where my interest is both personal and professional, I guess. We're working with the NHS as part of the food strategy, and we also work with our farmers in Fife, and we're looking at how do we feed our children in our schools the best way that we can. So we're looking at the whole food system and how do we turn that around to create a more sustainable for climate change, healthy for our population, local infrastructure that uses what we have. Some of the conversations, and I had to pop out quickly for a meeting with my manager, so I missed a little bit and came back in when you were talking about nutrition and how to measure nutrition, which I found really interesting, because we've been looking at maybe that as something, if we are going to buy organic meat or pasture for life meat in our public procurement, how much more nutritious is that than the processed burger that we buy in at a cost price? And we were thinking, do we just test that and look at nutrition? So that was fascinating to hear that there's very different ways of measuring nutrition. And talking about the gut and talking about how food is grown, my question, and I'm now coming to my question, is how do we support decision making around what is healthy and sustainable that's linked to sustainable health? So we try to reduce the amount of poisons that the food is grown with, the chemicals. But then how does that polyphenol of that plant and that nutrition that goes into that food affect the health of that person? So it's linking a little bit to what the Zoe is, but not necessarily linking to just the gut. Is the way that we grow food naturally, so it naturally has all its, without any chemical inputs, that enables it to talk to the different parts of our body that we have yet to understand how we do that. And then how do we transfer that knowledge, if we don't need to tell everybody it, into decision making that's going to help healthy decisions for future generations?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that question. I'll try and answer it. I mean, it'd be very hard to find a quantitative method for you to use to justify some of these decisions. I mean, at the simplest level, I would simply argue that, again, I go back to probably livestock is easier to quantify, but put it this way, an animal, a healthy animal that doesn't need preventive pharmaceutical interventions being a healthy animal will produce healthy food. That would be my overriding principle. Whereas an animal that doesn't, so an animal that lives, as I said, in 6 weeks in a shed with another 50,000 birds, living in its own species, that needs to be kept alive, very high mortality rate, will not produce healthy food. Now, how you if you need a way to quantify what healthy means or prove it to a body for policy, in many ways, I don't have an answer to that, because it's very hard to quantify that in a simple way. Again, you could go down the route of saying, well, let's look at the nutrition and how it impacts on the body, etc., etc. We can, but I guess I take it, maybe this is where I show my fundamental ideology, which is very different from that of nutritionists. I take it as a given that a healthy animal or a healthy plant will produce different results from an unhealthy plant or unhealthy animal. By plant being healthy or unhealthy, I mean a similar concept. I mean, as some of the organic growers here will know, if the soil is very healthy, the plant generally can look after itself. If it's in a healthy environment with other plants, with healthy soils, plants do well. On the other hand, very depleted soils, very poor growing conditions, plants don't do well on their own, and then they need interventions. Again, they will produce a different food output. So I'm not sure I've helped you at all, but I'm saying that would be my bottom line. How you can translate it into policy that will satisfy people or policymakers who want to say, well, where is the data? I don't have data.
Mm. And also, if we want to say we need more money to buy organic food rather than non-organic food, how do we say to them, well, this is going to be better?
I think that the starting point might be to say, we want to buy whole foods as opposed to processed foods. In other words, we're willing to put more cooking into whatever food we're making, because that's already one of the best starts, because the disaster that is the food in hospitals and in schools is that usually it is ultra-processed food. I've seen it myself firsthand. There's very little cooking that happens in a lot of school diners and lots of hospital kitchens. Very little. A lot of the food is pre-made, pre-packaged, heated, served, pre-cooked, everything else. So a really good starting point is to say we want whole foods as opposed to processed foods or ultra-processed foods. And then if you manage to get that far, then you can look at which whole foods you source. And some of the, you're in Scotland, you mentioned some of the, pasture-fed beef and lamb and things like that. Especially if you go for different cuts for bulk cooking, stews don't have to be that expensive and things like that, And in my book, I think I always say soups, stews, and salads are the foundations of home cookery. Those three things, because you can put a lot of great ingredients into them and not always the most expensive. But yeah, you have a tough task ahead of you, and I don't have easy help.
Thank you.
Matthew, finally.
Yeah, actually, I might need to jump in a minute because my daughter needs taken to the station. But I just want to pick up on the food quality idea, the food quality standard that I'm working on. I've looked at nutrients in food. It doesn't add up to being able to make a quality standard based on the nutrients in food. Every single plant has its own unique nutrient composition. So, in developing Griffin's aim of being able to understand food quality and measure it, we need to look beyond just nutrients. And so this is where the term nutrient variation means, why are all these nutrients arranged in such a way? Now, if you increase the value of one nutrient, one mineral, it affects the value of two other minerals. And those two minerals affect the value of two more minerals. So in order for a plant to create a balance of nutrients, there's something going on associated with that plant that helps to understand the environment that it's growing in, the soil resources that it's got, the way it's being nurtured. That plant is consciously, I'm using that word now, consciously balancing its nutrient profile. And in that process of balancing the nutrients is possibly another quality it's like a hidden quality that nobody's really touched on yet. It might explain the vitality aspect to food, it's about a living plant being able to balance all the nutrients that it has. So in developing a food quality standard, we've looked at nutrients. We know that there's not a way of defining it with that. We're moving beyond that now to taste. And when you run taste testing, comparative taste tests, what you're doing is you're using the ability of a human and our sensory body to literally analyze trillions of variables all at one time. Because the amounts of nutrients in the food, the microbes in the soil that are interacting with it, the gut microbes, the whole thing, it mounts up to trillions and trillions of life forms that are all working cooperatively together. So when you bring that into a happy family, then the balance of nutrients in the food is an expression of all that symbiotic activity that's taken place. And in order to understand that more, to help us build our food quality standard, we're using the Brix measurement, the refractometer, because it's a super simple test. And it does have a lot of it's a useful piece of information combined with the taste testing. So we're running projects now. We've got a schools project going in Shropshire. Silka's running that for us. And we're going to get children to see if they can identify the difference in quality using taste and Brix measurements. And if we can do that, we can identify high quality, low quality food. And it comes back to our sensory perception of knowing what that is.
I think taste is a really interesting indicator for sure. I mean, I think that some tests have been done, even like blind tests. Going back to my chicken, I think most blind tests would reveal that people taste it as very different things in terms of density and flavor and depth of flavor and so on. So taste can be really indicative. The other thing I was going to say was that there is an added complication to what I'm hearing, which is about the complexity of the food itself, is how different foods interact together. So, you know, when you combine foods together even in a recipe, then certain properties of one are highlighted by the other or not, as the case may be. So it's a real complex issue, and in many ways, we probably never know all the full details. And you know, I go back to the thing: focus on where does that single, very complex beetroot come from, and then probably things will go quite well. You know, if you combine lots of things like that have been very well grown and very well selected, then the details are interesting and important, but it'll be very hard to ever quantify.
Silke, go on.
Yes, I want to add to this because yes, I'm working with Matthew and at Griffin, and to add what you were saying about using taste, actually and not being so convinced that Zoe's vision of the future of using AI and whatnot to help us with our food decisions. What we have found is it's deeply empowering for people to realize that there is a difference, first of all, when you do these blind taste side-by-side testings, and it's ever so simple. So what I like about the whole concept and coming back to really who are we actually as human beings? Who are we in this whole scenario? And do you remember what are we actually equipped with, and why is that so? Why do we have all these taste buds? Why are we so able to taste? That is, I think that's a hint. This is what we should be using and educating people about. And like I say, I wanted to say it's very empowering, and we have it. We have our senses, but it does need a bit of re-education in some parts. So yes, just wanted to add that.
Can I just jump in and say goodbye? I've got my daughter to take to the railway station. Thank you so much.
Really nice to see
and
you.
Thank you all. Been lovely. And see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
What else? What else? We've overrun as usual. So if there's
Thank you.
is there one more question there somewhere? Going once, going twice. Jenny, there you go. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, just going on the taste scenario that Matthew and Silke were talking about. Interesting using children. I can see that would be, their taste buds are unsullied. But my experience with my grandchildren is they like what they like, and they don't necessarily like anything that might, like, for instance, it takes to have olives. It's not every child that would enjoy olives. How do you get around that, Silke?
I think it comes back to the purpose and your intention, and I'd be already so our purpose and intention with these taste testings is really about when we have a group of people, do they as a group come to is there a majority who thinks that if you have 4 carrots, that one of them is better than the others using their taste? And we confirm this with using the bricks, the refractometer, which gives us an indication of the solids in the plant juice. And we find that there's that tends to be a correlation between what people already taste and what you can kind of the indicator of the refractometer. So this is different. This is about which one is higher quality in terms of taste. That's what we are testing. We are not making people like something they don't want. And I will say to your question, people know if you leave them alone, they know what's good for them, kind of, especially children, I think. But that's a very personal question, and it's a different question from what we are actually looking at when we do the taste tests. So I don't really want to get into this this is family stuff, I would almost say.
It's very simple. If a child that you're using as a tester wants to get up from this chair, just zap them with electricity, they'll come back very quickly.
I'll say something quickly about this because, I come from what I would define a very gastronomic culture, and I think the palate, like many things, has to have a certain education. And especially as a child, a lot of it is exposure to lots of different flavors and quality food, because it's basically if little Johnny, when he's 9, only likes 3 or 4 foods, I think something has gone wrong with how the parents or whoever looks after little Johnny have raised him in terms of what he eats. It's not normal for a human being to get to age of 8 or 9 and only like chips and chicken or whatever it is. So the palate has to be habituated and tested. And not to wax lyrical about my childhood, but like by the age of 6 or 7, I knew the name of 60, 70 vegetables probably, because there were so many, and all the fruits. I was exposed to all those flavors, and inevitably there might be things you end up not liking. I mean, if your grandchildren don't like olives, maybe they never will. And also some flavors people only really get to like as adults. Like really dark chocolate, usually most children don't like it. And then when the adults might do. So there's also that factor. But I think exposure to great flavors as a child makes a great difference. There are some flavors that are very popular only because people have been habituated as a child. I'll give you an extreme example. So when I came to England, I first ate flavored crisps. Okay, so crisps with, prawn cocktail or cheese and onion, whatever they're called. And I promise you, I almost gagged when I first ate them, and I never ate them again. And I think when I smelled them on the train or somewhere, I found them repulsive. And they're very synthetic completely synthetic flavors, and the flavors that you have to be habituated. I'm saying if I had been fed them as a child, I would have grown up liking them. So the only reason why an adult might like all these flavored crisps is probably because they've eaten them since they were a child. Had they been given them as adults the first time, chances are they're very, very odd pseudo flavors. On the bright side, I think even someone who's used to eating lots of junk foods, if exposed to really well cooked proper food, often come to like it. So you can make someone a healthy version of the junk food. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a beef burger. There's nothing wrong with fried chicken, but how it's made, where the ingredients come from, is what really matters. So in principle, you could get someone to eat the flavor they like, but a higher version of it, if you will. But my advice to you is keep giving the kids different foods, and sometimes make it clear that some things should be eaten. I mean, I remember, I was expected to eat, certain courses if I wanted the dessert or something like that. In this day and age, it might seems very harsh, but it isn't really.
Glyn.
Hi, yeah, I really agree with that last bit. Having done a lot of these experiments with the kids, and there has definitely been a change in tastes. When I first started doing this, using the refractometer and using, strawberries grown at home in good, healthy soil.
I hope
And
you weren't. I hope you weren't zapping Josie with electricity.
Oh, all the time. That's why we are a bit strange down here. But I did the test recently again at the same primary school, and a lot of you could tell it because I've got one of these. I've had one of these nutrient density meters. Ours is called the CO, and I've had it for years, and I've been keeping records on it all the time. So I know that the strawberries we had were a similar density to the ones that I had before, according to this the Zapper. So I was pretty sure that the density side of it was fixed, but the kids didn't recognize it as much, the higher nutrient strawberries or the better tasting. I could taste it, but fewer of the kids could. So whether their taste buds are actually being altered by the type of foods that are actually available in because they're collecting them from supermarkets, they've got less they're not having the variety that they have, especially here in Jersey, where 90% of our food is actually imported. So when it comes over from wherever, Spain, and it's lost all of its a lot of its natural health. It's been lost on its way. I think you kids can, our palates can be changed.
I agree.
Moving on from that very quickly, I believe that it's got to start back up with going back to the basics, the soil. I think it's been raised a couple of times. And I think a lot of it will come down to when we change the practices to actually figure out how to measure the soil health and say the soil carbon, which is basically vital to the soil health as well, especially in the UK where soil carbon, everyone knows this is a big thing of mine. Has fallen by so much, and so the health is going to be equally along the same lines. And until we can actually start figuring out how to baseline soil health and soil carbon and biodiversity stuff, and then rewarding the farmers to actually, the ones that actually improve it, maybe through, corporate reporting responsibilities or directives, then, that's one way we can do it. But there's a big resistance, at the moment everyone's on this, as I call it, this CSR, the ESG, environmental social gains, this net zero stuff, which is actually useless generally because it's not doing anything for additional soil carbon. But when governments can up their game and start moving into the Paris alignment, and forcing corporates to actually remove their carbon, not just reduce or avoid, I think that will be the game changer. But I think there's an opportunity to actually figure out how to do that measuring, recording, and verification side.
Thank you.
Anything to add on that, Federico?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big topic of how all of this also correlates to the whole carbon debate, and in many ways, again, we have a problem where it's very, very hard to measure any farming system from that perspective. What we do know is that the more regenerative methods of farming, living soils tend to capture carbon in one way or the other, or at the very least do not leach huge amounts of it indirectly. Industrial systems are built upon a notion of petroleum, before they even get to the field. The fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, they really are built on a notion of petroleum and as a factory farming systems. So in many ways, building soil carbon, great, but eliminating the very long supply chain in agriculture and having a more cyclical system is most likely where the solution will be somewhere. In the book, I have a sort of layman's guide to agricultural cycles, and basically it's a difference between a very linear cycle that starts in an oil well or a mine to one which is broadly cyclical. Don't get me wrong, every farming system has lots of gaps and inputs. Even the best organic farm needs some fossil fuels, to drive a tractor, to fix tools. There's no escape from that, at least today. All food systems are reliant on industrial inputs and generate some pollution and have some loopholes, some nutrients escaping. But if we think cyclical as opposed to linear, we go a long way. And then if we can figure out ways of measuring carbon capture, etc., great. But it's a very hard task. And there's also a difference between carbon that's sequestered and the ones that stays in the soil, the one that doesn't. It's a whole huge debate, as is the whole methane debate from livestock, which is about a lot in the book. But yeah.
Glenn, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just come back on that very quickly. Agreed on all of those points. But it's more of sort of like, well, taking Jersey as the example, where, we used to grow a wide variety of crops and we were very sustainable during the war. We were cut off completely. And we had to sustain ourselves. Now we're importing 90%. And there is a direct correlation, particularly between, soil health, well, the level of carbon and soil health that we've got, and the inability to actually now grow any crops and rely on, imports. And I think that's the same with a lot of countries around the world now. You take the Roman Empire as an example. A lot of people say that the demise of the Roman Empire was the salting of the soils. And you've seen how, over time, big communities have grown up and depleted soils. So it's a matter of sort of like the whole carbon thing is really, there's many ways of doing it, but it's really a way of funding farmers to actually start to concentrate on building that, the soil quality, to actually be able to grow the crops then. As someone said earlier, knowing what your food eats is really important.
And also retaining water. That's a huge issue because apart from the Roman Empire, if you look even earlier, the so-called Fertile Crescent, one of the cradles of agriculture, which is now basically the Middle East region, Lebanon, Syria, all the way to Iraq, is definitely no longer green or fertile. And this happened way before industrialization, and mostly was excessive cultivation, the chopping down of all the trees, effectively, deforestation, overcultivation, overuse of groundwater, no water retention, and that led to the drying up of the soils. So that's happened in many parts of the world. And a lot of it is linked to agriculture. So even before fossil fuels, a lot of soils have been ruined by poor management and inability to retain water and nutrients in the soil.
Right. One last one, because we're gonna be sitting here until midnight. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Guys, thank you very much for this engaging conversation. I mean, this is definitely a topic that has brought out a lot from you guys. So thank you very much for participating in this. Thank you, Federico, for spending the time with us.
Thank you so much.
If you're interested in Federico's book, the link is in the email that you've all received. Click on it. You go to Amazon. You can get yourself a copy, a paperback or a hard copy, or an Audible if you prefer to listen to it. And
I don't have Audible, sorry. I've a Kindle paperback and hardback, but no
sorry,
Audible
a
yet.
Kindle.
I've got a couple of candidates who want to read it, but I haven't got there yet, I'm afraid.
Okay, no Audible yet. Get your chat GTP to read it too.
And it's quite long as well. But I'm also sharing my email if anyone has any questions, wants to stay in touch, or what have you.
Super.
I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Super. If you want to get in touch with Federico, there's the email in the chat. I'll send that also in a follow-up email when I get the what's it called, the recording up on the YouTubes. Cool. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks everyone. I really appreciate it.
Super. See you next week or
Thank you so much. Oh, and thank you, Charles. Thank you. Bye everyone. Bye.